The persecution of the Muslims was a terrible phase in early Islam. There were numerous heart-rending incidents in which Muslims were tortured and often killed by the Quraysh. The collective memories of the early Muslim community catalogued the injuries and casualties suffered by its members, and in this biography of the Prophet of Islam, peace be upon him, it is fitting that we mention the lives and deaths of those most ardent followers, those who recognized the truth of his message and died believing in Allah and his messenger, peace be upon him. Bilal bin Rabah, may Allah be pleased with him, was the slave of Umayyah bin Khalaf. Incensed at his slave's assertion of spiritual independence, Umayyah would hand him over to the street urchins after tying a rope around his neck. As they would drag him, Bilal would recite 1, 1 in reference to the oneness of God. Umayyah would also bring Bilal out at noon and throw him on his back on the burning sand or stone with a heavy rock on his chest. Then he would say to Bilal, may Allah be pleased with him, now, by God, you will lie here until you either die or deny Muhammad, peace be upon him, and worship Lat and Uzza. Bilal endured the affliction, reaffirming his faith in Allah by calling out 1, 1. Finally, the torture ended when Abu Bakr, may Allah be pleased with him, saw Bilal, may Allah be pleased with him, as he was passing by. His wealth was now a tool with which to earn Allah's pleasure, and he purchased Bilal and freed him. Amir bin Fuhaira, may Allah be pleased with him, was another early believer who endured beatings so merciless that he lost his senses and did not know what he was saying. Afla, may Allah be pleased with him, also known as Abdul Faqih, was the slave of Banu Abdul Daar. He was usually taken out in the scorching heat at noon, in fetters, and forced to lie naked, with a heavy stone on his chest. Often the agony rendered him insensible. On one occasion, the pagans tied a rope around his feet and neck and dragged him about until he nearly died. He was finally rescued by Abu Bakr, may Allah be pleased with him, who, unable to see a fellow Muslim suffer, so brought him out of bondage. Afla was among the early Muslims who later migrated to Abyssinia. Khabbab ibn al-Arat, may Allah be pleased with him, a well-known companion of the Prophet, peace be upon him, was bought by a woman of Banu Khuzah named Anmar bint Sabah. He was a blacksmith, and to make Khabbab renounce his belief in the Prophet, peace be upon him, Anmar would brand him on the back with his own tools. Others would also join in the torture. They would twist his neck, pull out his hair, and even throw him on burning coals. A rock would be placed on him so that he could not move. Miraculously, Khabbab's faith grew stronger with each attempt to drive him back to disbelief. Zinera, may Allah be pleased with her, was a Roman slave girl who embraced Islam. When the pagans found out that she had become Muslim, they tortured her until she went blind, and gloated that the wrath of their gods, Lat and Uzza, had caused her to go blind. It was Allah who had blinded her, she told them, and if He so willed, He would restore her eyesight. The next morning she awoke to find her vision completely restored. Her tormentors, however, were not convinced of the miracle and claimed this was nothing more than Muhammad, peace be upon him, sorcery. Abis, may Allah be pleased with her, was a slave of Banu Zahra. She suffered at the hands of her master, Malik Aswad bin Abd Yaghouth, who began to torture her when she accepted Islam. Malik was a sworn enemy of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and used to ridicule him relentlessly. A slave of Amr bin Mu'il from Banu Adi embraced Islam. Her torturer was none other than Umar bin Khattab, who at that point was still an unbeliever. Umar, famous for his strength, would beat her until he was exhausted. He would then stop, informing her that he was not stopping out of mercy, but out of fatigue. Your Lord will also treat you accordingly, retorted the slave girl. Among the slaves who embraced Islam were also Nadia and her daughter, may Allah be pleased with them. These two were the slaves of a woman of Banu Abdul Dar. Mother and daughter suffered punishment on account of their faith until Abu Bakr, may Allah be pleased with him, bought them from their mistress and set them free. Just as he had done with Bilal, Amir bin Fuhaira and Abu Faqih, may Allah be pleased with them. His use of his wealth in this manner earned him reproof from his father, Abu Quhafa, who told him, I notice you are freeing weak hands. Had you freed strong men, they would stand you in good stead. In reply, Abu Bakr, may Allah be pleased with him, said, I seek but the pleasure of Allah. Through the following verses that were revealed, Allah indicated that Abu Bakr, may Allah be pleased with him, had succeeded in his undertaking. I warn you all of a fire blazing fiercely. None shall enter it except the most wretched, those who deny and turn away. However, the God-fearing will be saved from the fire, those who spend their wealth in order to purify themselves, who spend without seeking a reward in return. They seek only the countenance of their Lord, the Most High. Verily, soon they will be pleased. Quran 92, 14-21. Not all the slaves who became Muslim were ransomed. Some succumbed to their injuries, while others were forced to recant in public, although they remained believers at heart. Ammar bin Yasir and his parents belonged to the Banu Makhzum tribe, of which Abu Jahl was a chieftain. Led by Abu Jahl, various people from the tribe would take Ammar and his family to Abta and leave them there in the scorching sun. The Prophet, peace be upon him, saw their plight and exhorted them to stand fast in faith, saying, Patience, O family of Yasir, patience. Your destination is paradise. O Allah, forgive the family of Yasir. And stand fast they did. Yasir, Ammar's father, bore the torture until his death. Sumayya bint Khayyat, may Allah be pleased with her, the mother of Ammar, was a slave of Abu Khudayfa Makhzumi. This frail old woman died and attained the honour of being the first martyr in Islam when Abu Jahl struck a lance at her genitals. As for Ammar, the torture became unbearable for him. The Polytheists would make him wear a coat of mail and put a heavy red stone on his chest. Overpowered by distress, he uttered whatever the Polytheists bade him to say. However, at heart he remained full of faith. Ammar was remorseful at his body's betrayal of his heart and soul. With the revelation of the following verse, however, Ammar and all the believers were heartened, for Allah assured them that He looked at believing hearts, not at tongues weakened by torture. Those who renounce faith in Allah and open their hearts to disbelief, except for those believers who are forced to recant outwardly, will earn Allah's wrath and a great punishment. Quran 16:106. While some form of hostility from the community at large was only to be expected, it was strange that even the immediate families of the new Muslims joined in the persecution. Love vanished in the face of allegiance to their idols. When Mus'ab bin Umair, may Allah be pleased with him, accepted Islam, his privileged lifestyle ended. His mother refused to give him food and drink and turned him out of her house. Defenseless and shunned by the one who had given birth to him, he was brutally tortured, and his skin was peeled off like the slough of a snake by his tormentors. Suhaib bin Sinan Rumi, may Allah be pleased with him, was another Muslim who was tortured to the extent that he lost control over what he said and babbled anything his tormentors had him utter. In the eyes of the Quraysh, slaves who became Muslim were rebels to be tortured to death. Their low social status left them vulnerable to all kinds of abuse. Nevertheless, not even wealth and social standard guaranteed complete immunity to anyone who became Muslim. Uthman bin Affan, may Allah be pleased with him, was a well-to-do person in the community, but he too was tortured in various ways. Once, his uncle wrapped him tightly in a mat and burned incense from below. Abu Bakr and Talha bin Ubaydullah, may Allah be pleased with them, were also harassed. Nawfal bin Khalid and, it is said, Uthman bin Ubaydullah trussed both of them with the same rope so that they could not pray and practice their new faith. However, both Abu Bakr and Talha, may Allah be pleased with them, were found praying, the rope having been mysteriously untied. Since both of them had been fastened with the same rope, they came to be called Qarain, which means joined together. Abu Jahl, who is referred to several times in the Quran for his implacable hatred of Islam and his arrogance, was one of the prominent Makkans who had made it his mission to fight Islam and its followers. His hate and ire grew every time he heard of someone becoming Muslim. If the new Muslim held a high position in society, Abu Jahl would rebuke him and threaten him with the loss of property and honour. If someone from a lower station accepted Islam, Abu Jahl would beat him severely and incite others to do the same. As a general policy, the Polytheists persecuted any new Muslim, often to the point of death, especially if the convert belonged to a weaker section of tribal society. If, however, they saw a prominent person accept Islam, they proceeded more cautiously, as only polytheists of the same social status could challenge the convert. Because the Prophet, peace be upon him, had enjoyed great prestige and belonged to a highly respected tribe, his opponents did not dare mistreat him the way they did the slave converts to Islam. In addition to being from a noble tribe, he also enjoyed the protection of his uncle, Aboo Taalib, who was venerated as a great chieftain. Aboo Taalib was a towering personality from Banu Abdul Manaf, a family that had gained the respect of not only the Quraysh, but also the whole of Arabia. The people of Makkah held him in high esteem, and no one would even think of dishonouring him by harming his nephew. For these reasons, the pagans had to be quite careful in how they opposed the Prophet, peace be upon him. They decided to hold talks with Aboo Taalib, talks in which they would hint at what might befall Muhammad, peace be upon him, if he continued opposing their religion. After considerable thought as to strategy, some nobles of the Quraysh came to Aboo Taalib and said to him, "Your nephew speaks ill of our gods, casts blame on our religion, calls us ignorant and frivolous, and denounces our fathers as depraved and misguided. Either you stop him or cut him off so that we can deal with him." Aboo Taalib answered them mildly and let them leave without an altercation. Muhammad, peace be upon him, however, continued to proclaim himself Allah's prophet and continued to call on all to embrace Islam. Soon the Quraysh realized that Aboo Taalib was not going to ask his nephew to stop his rebellious preaching. They could no longer keep silent, and eventually they all came together to plan their response to the situation. Afterwards, they again met with Aboo Taalib, and this time their words were not so honeyed. They warned him sternly, "O Aboo Taalib, you are old and we hold you in high esteem. We asked you to restrain your nephew, but you did nothing. By God, we cannot tolerate this any longer. Our fathers are denounced. We are called ignorant, and our gods are insulted. Either you stop him, or we will fight you both until one side perishes." Aboo Taalib felt the sting of these belligerent words. The polytheist of Makkah had challenged him, and he took the threat seriously. He sent for the Prophet, peace be upon him, and told him of what the men of the Quraysh had said. "Have mercy on me and yourself," he told his nephew, "and do not impose on me a burden greater than I can bear." When the Prophet, peace be upon him, heard what Aboo Taalib had to say, he, peace be upon him, replied, "O my uncle, I swear by Allah, if they were to place the sun in my right hand and the moon in my left and ask me to abandon this mission, I would not turn from it until Allah made me victorious or I perished therein." Witnessing Muhammad, peace be upon him's resolve, Aboo Taalib unhesitatingly offered his nephew his full support. "Come back, my nephew. Go where you please and say what you will. By God, I will never turn away from you, come what may." The Quraysh saw that their threats and challenges had been ignored. Muhammad, peace be upon him, was still preaching a doctrine that defamed their gods and the customs of their ancestors. They also found that Aboo Taalib was not about to abandon his nephew in the face of threats. Instead, he seemed to be prepared to fight the entire tribe in order to protect him. The Quraysh considered the immense potential danger of the situation. Muhammad, peace be upon him, was popular among the people of Makkah, although he represented a threat to their way of life. They held more meetings to try and come up with ways to deal with him. At last, they decided to make Aboo Taalib a proposal. The idea revolved around Amara bin Walid, a handsome young boy from the Quraysh tribe. They took him to Aboo Taalib and said, "O Aboo Taalib, take this youth from us and treat him as your own son. Give him your complete support. In exchange for him, give us your nephew, a young man who has challenged the ways of your forefathers and caused disputes among the Meccans, denouncing them as ignorant men who have deviated from the straight path. We shall then put him to death. After all, we are giving you one man in exchange of another." Aboo Taalib could only respond to such a ridiculous idea with sarcasm. By God, you are offering me a very bad bargain. You are giving me your son so that I can feed him lavishly, and asking for my son so that you may kill him? By God, it will never happen. When neither threats nor bargains proved successful in swaying Aboo Taalib, the Quraysh decided to persecute the Prophet, peace be upon him. Simultaneously, they intensified their campaign against the believers. Because of the Prophet, peace be upon him's high position in Meccan society, only those of like standing dared mistreat him. Those who harassed the Prophet, peace be upon him, in his own house were Abu Lahab, Hakam bin Abi al-As bin Umayyah, Uqba bin Abi Mu'ayt, Aday bin Khamra Taqifi, Ibn al-Asta, Hadab, all of whom were his neighbours. When the Prophet, peace be upon him, bowed down in prayer, someone threw the fetus of a camel on his back. Others would throw similar filth at his door. The Prophet, peace be upon him, would remove it with a piece of wood and say, "O Banu Abdul Manaf, what kind of neighbourhood is this?" Whenever Umayyah bin Khalaf saw the Prophet, peace be upon him, he would taunt him before the people of Mecca. Similarly, his brother Abi bin Khalaf crumbled a rotten bone and throw it in the face of the Prophet, peace be upon him. He would also say to the Prophet, peace be upon him, "O Muhammad, peace be upon him, I have a horse named Ud, and I feed it 3 heaps of food so that I can kill you while upon its back." One day, the Prophet, peace be upon him, answered his challenge by saying, "No, it is I who will kill you." The Prophet, peace be upon him's words came true when he killed Abi during the Battle of Uhud. On another occasion, Uqba bin Abi Mu'ayt sat beside the Prophet, peace be upon him, listening to him. When Abi bin Khalaf found out that his friend Uqba had been with the Prophet, peace be upon him, he chided him for that, and then said to Uqba, "Go and spit in the face of Muhammad, peace be upon him." Ever mindful that allegiance to the tribe came before even honour and decency, Uqba rose from his feet, approached the Prophet, peace be upon him, and spat in his face. Abu Lahab, the Prophet, peace be upon him's uncle, who had freed a slave to celebrate his nephew's birth, became his sworn enemy from the day he heard his nephew call the people to Islam from atop Mount Safa. The 2 sons of Abu Lahab, Utbah and Atiba, had married the Prophet, peace be upon him's daughters, Ruqayyah and Kulthum, may Allah be pleased with them, respectively. Abu Lahab ordered both his sons to divorce their wives, threatening never to see them again if they refused. His wife, Jalil Ati bin Harb, also asked them to divorce their wives, for they had become disbelievers. Utbah and Atiba obeyed their parents and divorced the Prophet, peace be upon him's daughters. Jalil was no less vicious in her enmity. Her nephew by marriage was posturing as a messenger, daring to oppose the gods she held dear. She resolved to punish him. She used to scatter prickly bits of wood over the path that the Prophet, peace be upon him, and his companions would pass. When Jalil heard that a short chapter of the Quran, Surah Abu Lahab, had been revealed to the Prophet, peace be upon him, which condemned her to hell for this very act, she began searching for him, armed with a rock. He was sitting near the Kaaba, along with Abu Bakr, may Allah be pleased with him. She strode up to Abu Bakr, may Allah be pleased with him, and asked him, "Where has your companion gone? I have come to know that he speaks ill of me. By God, if I find him, I shall hurl the stone at his face. Look, I am also a poet." She then uttered the following verses and went away. "We disobeyed the blameworthy, rejected his call, and renounced his religion with disdain." Abu Bakr, may Allah be pleased with him, was amazed that Jalil had not seen the Prophet, peace be upon him, sitting right beside him. "O Prophet, did she fail to see you?" He said, peace be upon him, "Yes, she could not see me because Allah seized her sight." Meanwhile, the Quraysh invented a new way of abusing the Prophet, peace be upon him. They began calling him Mudhammam instead of Muhammad, the meaning of which is the opposite of his real name. Muhammad is one who is highly praised, while Mudhammam is one who is vehemently condemned. Allah, however, protected the Prophet, peace be upon him's honour, by revealing that the Quraysh abused one name as Mudhammam, while the Prophet was Muhammad by name. As has been mentioned earlier, one of the most ardent enemies of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and his followers was Aboo Jahl. His actual name was Abu Hakam, which literally means father of wisdom. But his behaviour towards the Prophet, peace be upon him, and the early Muslims earned him the title Abu Jahl, father of ignorance. Anyone who abandoned the local pagan religion for Islam was a renegade, and Abu Jahl would take him to task for his treachery. He abused the Prophet, peace be upon him, openly, and would attempt to obstruct the Prophet, peace be upon him, from performing his prayers. One day, Abu Jahl saw the Prophet, peace be upon him, performing his prayers, and began harassing and threatening him as he prayed. At last, the Prophet, peace be upon him, caught hold of a piece of cloth around Abu Jahl's neck, and shaking him strongly, quoted these 2 verses from the Quran. Woe to you, again, woe to you, woe to you. Quran 75:34-35. Abu Jahl shot back, Muhammad, peace be upon him, you are challenging me. By God, you and your Lord cannot do me any harm. I am the strongest man in this valley. Eager for revenge, Abu Jahl asked his comrades, does Muhammad, peace be upon him, put his face on the earth in your presence? Yes, they replied. By Lat and Uzza, Abu Jahl swore, if I ever see him do so, I shall trample his face and neck into the dust. The day came when Abu Jahl saw the Prophet, peace be upon him, performing his prayers. So he marched toward him with the intention of carrying out his threat. Suddenly, onlookers saw him retreat before reaching the defenceless Muhammad, peace be upon him, his arms clawing at the air. What happened, Abu Hakam? The people asked. A trench of fire and a screen of devastation stood between me and him, the dazed Abu Jahl replied. The Prophet, peace be upon him, remarked to his followers, had he come near me, the angels would have swooped down upon every limb of his. Uqba bin Abu Mu'ayt was another who earned eternal disgrace for his despicable treatment of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Once the Prophet was praying near the Kaaba while Abu Jahl and his comrades were sitting nearby. Meanwhile, Abu Jahl asked the others, is there one who will bring the innards of a camel of Banu so-and-so and place it on Muhammad, peace be upon him's back while he is prostrating in prayer? Uqba, anxious to prove his daring, got up and returned with the intestines of a slaughtered camel. He stayed to the side until he saw the opportunity to catch the Prophet, peace be upon him, in prostration. When the Prophet, peace be upon him, bowed his head to the earth, Uqba laid the camel's intestines on the Prophet, peace be upon him's neck and shoulders. Abu Jahl and his followers burst into laughter, but the Prophet, peace be upon him, remained in prostration and did not raise his head. Someone informed the Prophet, peace be upon him's daughter, Fatima, may Allah be pleased with her, who then came running to the Kaaba. She removed the foul-smelling intestines from her father's back, and he raised his head and prayed to Allah, O Allah, seize the Quraysh. When Abu Jahl and his comrades heard Muhammad, peace be upon him's prayer, they felt a very heavy weight on their hearts, because they believed that in Makkah all prayers were granted. The Prophet, peace be upon him, continued to pray aloud in front of his enemies, mentioning each one by name and asking Allah to avenge him. The Quraysh were right about their misgivings regarding the Prophet, peace be upon him's prayers for retribution, for Allah soon answered it. In the Battle of Badr, which was the first battle the Muslims fought against the Meccan pagans, each person the Prophet, peace be upon him, mentioned in his prayer fell on the battlefield. It seemed as if the enemies of Islam far outnumbered the followers of the Prophet, peace be upon him. All the notables, with the exception of a discerning fortunate few like Abu Bakr and Uthman, may Allah be pleased with them, used their wealth and power to persecute the Prophet, peace be upon him. Besides Abu Jahl, the 5 prominent persons who used to ridicule the Prophet, peace be upon him, were Walid bin Mughira Makhzumi, Aswad bin Abdul Yaghut Zuhri, Abu Zam Aswad bin Abdul Muttalib Asadi, Harith bin Qais Khuzai, and As bin Wail Sahmi. The Prophet, peace be upon him, did not take revenge even once during the many years he lived in Makkah after he began his mission. He was content with Allah's promise that he himself would deal with his opponents and detractors. In the end, Muhammad, peace be upon him's harshest enemies met with agonizing deaths. Walid bin Mughira was merely scratched by an arrow, and he thought nothing of it. The angel Jibreel, peace be upon him, however, pointed towards the scratch, and it became inflamed. The wound plagued Walid for many years until he died. Likewise, Jibril, peace be upon him, pointed towards the head of Aswad bin Abd Yaghud, and he developed boils that caused his death. Another source states that these boils resulted from sunstroke that Jibril, peace be upon him, had inflicted on him. According to yet another narration, Jibril, peace be upon him, pointed towards Aswad's belly, and he developed dropsy that caused his belly to swell so much that he died. When Aswad bin Abdul Muttalib became excessive in his persecution of the Prophet, peace be upon him, the Prophet, peace be upon him, asked Allah to snatch his eyesight and to deprive him of fatherhood. In response to his supplication, Jibril, peace be upon him, was sent to strike his face with a thorny branch, so that Aswad lost his eyesight. He then struck his son dead. Harith bin Gaith, the last of these 5 previously named opponents of the Prophet, peace be upon him, met a horrible death. As he lay dying, his stomach filled with yellow fluid, and the contents of his intestines began to flow from his nose. Divine intervention and retribution came to those most active and vocal in their hatred of Islam. But for the most part, the Prophet, peace be upon him, quietly endured all the hardships, just as prophets before him had done. Looking at his patience and unshakable faith, the believers were heartened during their sufferings in the cause of Allah. Verbal abuse and physical threats continued, so the Prophet, peace be upon him, devised ways of defense. He took 2 steps to help secure the fledgling Muslims. First, the Prophet, peace be upon him, began using the house of Arqam bin Abi al-Arqam as a secret centre for prayer, preaching, education and training. Arqam's house was ideally located at the foot of Mount Safa, only a short walk from the Kaaba and its bustling crowds. The pagans who lived in the area, therefore, did not take notice of the many people who gathered in Arqam's house. The Prophet, peace be upon him, would meet his companions there and recite verses of the Quran to them, which they would then memorize. These arrangements allowed the early Muslims to learn the essential tenets of Islam and perform prayers in secret without incurring the wrath of their neighbours or other family members who had not converted. As for the Prophet, peace be upon him, he continued to perform his prayers in the open for all to see. In the face of persecution, insults and harassment, he kept preaching the message of Islam to everyone he met. It was the wisdom and mercy of Allah that the Prophet, peace be upon him, never refrained from carrying on with his mission, even under extremely adverse conditions. Because of his efforts, no soul will be able to argue on the Day of Judgment that Allah did not send a messenger to warn those who were astray and to show them the straight path.